The morning sun had barely cleared the Georgia tree line when Richard Harlow stepped out of his black Escalade convoy and onto the private tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson. 3 SUVs. 6 bodyguards. 2 assistants already typing on their phones before their feet hit the pavement. Harlow didn't walk. He arrived. Every step deliberate, every gesture calculated for the people watching. His gray suit was $4,000. His watch was $80,000. His company was worth $2.4 billion, and he made sure the world never forgot it. He was heading to a board meeting in New York. First class wasn't good enough anymore. A chartered Gulfstream G700 sat gleaming on the runway ahead of him, sleek, white, magnificent. Worth roughly $75 million on a clear day. But there was a man near the jet. A black man in gray coveralls, clipboard in hand, moving slowly around the aircraft's landing gear. Methodical. Quiet. Unhurried. Harlow barely looked at him. But then one of his yes-men laughed at something, and Harlow glanced over, and something about the man, the coveralls, maybe, or just the way he stood, made Harlow feel the need to say something. He should have kept walking. He should have stayed silent. Instead, the words left his mouth loud enough for everyone on the tarmac to hear. And what happened in the next 72 hours would end Richard Harlow's career, not with a scandal, not with a lawsuit, but with 3 quiet words from a man who never even raised his voice. Marcus Webb woke at 4:47 a.m. that Tuesday, the same time he'd woken almost every day for 23 years. Old habit. An old muscle memory from the days when early meant survival, when showing up before the sun was the only advantage a young black man from South Atlanta could manufacture for himself in a world that started the race 300 meters ahead of everybody who looked like him. He made his coffee the same way he always did. Black. No sugar. 2 cups. He stood at the kitchen window of his home, not a flashy house, not a mansion, just a solid, beautiful craftsman in Cascade Heights, the kind of neighborhood where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays and knew their neighbors' names, and he looked out at the magnolia tree his late mother had planted in the backyard 30 years ago. He thought about her most mornings. She had worked 2 jobs her entire life. A cleaning lady at a hotel downtown. A cashier at a grocery store on weekends. She had rough hands and a soft voice, and she had told Marcus exactly 3 things every single day of his childhood. Stay humble. Stay curious. And never, ever let anybody make you feel small. Marcus had spent a lifetime trying to honor all 3. At 20, he'd worked the floor at a small aircraft maintenance company in Hapeville, the kind of job people overlooked, changing oil, checking hydraulics, learning the bone structure of machines that weighed 40 tons and moved at 600 miles an hour. He was good with his hands. Better than good. He had a feel for engines the way some people have a feel for music, intuitive, almost spiritual, like the machine was telling him where it hurt. By 28, he had his own certification. By 32, he had his own shop. By 39, Webb Aviation Services had contracts with 4 regional carriers and 2 corporate charter companies. By 45, he had bought his first aircraft, a used Cessna Citation, nothing special, and leased it to a charter broker in Miami. Now, at 51, Marcus Webb owned 11 aircraft. 3 Gulfstreams. 2 Bombardiers. A handful of smaller turboprops used for regional charters. He had 42 employees, a maintenance facility at PDK Airport north of the city, and a portfolio of aviation assets that a Goldman Sachs analyst had once estimated, conservatively, at somewhere between $190 and $230 million. He did not wear it. He did not broadcast it. He drove a 9-year-old Ford F-150. He wore coveralls when he visited his aircraft because he genuinely liked checking on them himself, liked the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, liked running his hand along the fuselage the way a farmer walks his land. His CFO had told him 100 times to stop doing that. You're not a mechanic anymore, Marcus. You don't need to be on the tarmac. But Marcus Webb had never been able to stay away from the machines. They were where he came from. They were how he understood the world. So that Tuesday morning, he drove himself to Hartsfield-Jackson's private aviation terminal, badged through the gate, and walked out onto the tarmac to check on the G700. He was considering selling it. The charter revenue numbers had dipped. There was a better investment opportunity in a fractional ownership syndicate in Dubai. He wanted to see the aircraft one more time before he made the decision. He was standing at the nose gear, clipboard in hand, running through his checklist. When the convoy arrived, Marcus heard the SUVs before he saw them. 3 of them, rolling in tight formation, stopping 20 feet from the jet's air stairs. Doors opening. Men in black suits stepping out, scanning the tarmac with the practiced efficiency of people paid to look for threats. Then the man himself. Richard Harlow. Marcus recognized him immediately. You couldn't be in Atlanta's business world and not recognize Richard Harlow. His face was on billboards downtown. He was a fixture at the Commerce Club, at charity galas, at the kind of events where men in expensive suits congratulated each other on how much they'd donated to causes they'd never personally experienced. Harlow Corp was a conglomerate, logistics, real estate, a chain of regional airports, some manufacturing. Harlow had inherited a portion of it from his father-in-law and spent 20 years inflating its value through aggressive acquisitions and ruthless cost-cutting, which mostly meant layoffs. He'd been on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle 3 times. He had a foundation named after himself. Marcus had met his type before. Many times. He looked back at his clipboard. He heard the footsteps slow. And then Harlow's voice, smooth, easy, the voice of a man who had never once second-guessed himself, cut through the morning air. "Hey, Chief." Marcus didn't look up right away. He finished the notation he was making. "You see something wrong with this aircraft, or are you just here to look pretty?" Laughter. 3, 4 men. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes from people who laugh at everything their boss says because their salary depends on it. Marcus looked up slowly. Harlow was looking at him with the expression of a man who had never in his adult life been told no. Slightly amused. Slightly contemptuous. Like a man who had just noticed a stray dog wandering onto his property. "I'm just asking," Harlow continued, louder now, performing for his audience, "because I've got a meeting in New York at 2 o'clock, and I'd hate for whatever you're doing to make me late. You know how to do your job, right? Or should I get someone qualified out here?" More laughter. One of the assistants actually covered her mouth. Marcus held Harlow's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled, one quiet, unhurried smile, and looked back at his clipboard. "You're good," Marcus said simply. "Jet's fine." Harlow stared at him for a moment, almost surprised by the lack of reaction. Then he snorted, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked toward the air stairs. "Know your place," Harlow said, almost casually, almost to no one, as he passed. The words landed like stones in still water. Nobody on that tarmac said anything. Marcus watched Harlow disappear into the aircraft. Then he took out his phone. He made one call. It lasted 45 seconds. "It's Marcus," he said when the line picked up. "Pull up the charter booking on N742WX for this morning." A pause. Keyboard sounds. "Harlow. Richard Harlow. Party of 6, New York, today. That's the one. Who booked it?" Another pause. "His corporate travel desk. Third-party broker." "Right." Marcus looked out across the tarmac. The air stairs were still down. He could hear voices from inside the aircraft. "Cancel it." Silence. "Marcus. Cancel the booking. Full refund, no penalty. Cite a maintenance hold." "There's no maintenance issue on that aircraft. There will be by the time anyone asks." I found a discrepancy in the nose gear inspection log. Routine. But we're not releasing the aircraft until it's resolved. His operations manager, Diane Chen, had worked with Marcus for 11 years. She knew his voice. She knew what it meant when it got that quiet. Understood, she said. How long is the hold? Marcus thought about the board meeting in New York. The 2 o'clock start time Harlow had just mentioned. 48 hours should do it, Marcus said. He hung up. He walked back to his truck and drove off the tarmac, pausing at the gate to show his badge. In the rearview mirror, he could already see the air stairs retracting. He smiled, just slightly. But that wasn't why he'd made the call. Not really. The truth, the real reason, was something much larger. Something that had been building for 18 months. And Richard Harlow's little performance on that tarmac had simply forced Marcus's hand a week ahead of schedule. Because Marcus Webb hadn't just been checking on his jet that morning. He'd been checking on his investment. And what he'd recently discovered about Harlow Corp's regional airport division was the kind of thing that didn't just end careers. It ended companies. 18 months earlier, Marcus had been approached about a real estate and infrastructure deal. Harlow Corp was acquiring a portfolio of regional airports across the Southeast, bundling them into a new subsidiary, and looking for private capital partners to round out the balance sheet. The pitch was polished. The numbers looked solid. The projected returns were attractive. Marcus had passed. Something about the structure bothered him. He couldn't name it right away. He hired an independent analyst, a woman named Patricia Osei, a former SEC examiner who now ran her own consulting firm in Buckhead, and asked her to look at the acquisition targets. Patricia had taken 3 weeks. When she came back to Marcus's office on a Wednesday afternoon, she'd closed the door, set a manila folder on his desk, and said, "Marcus, you need to hear this carefully." 3 of the regional airports Harlow Corp was acquiring had existing infrastructure contracts with municipal governments, long-term leases, maintenance agreements, FAA funding tie-ins. Standard stuff. But embedded in the contract language were override clauses, quiet little provisions that allowed the acquiring entity to renegotiate federal funding allocations if certain operational efficiency benchmarks weren't met. In practice, what this meant, Harlow Corp could acquire the airports, trigger the override clauses, redirect federal airport improvement grants away from their intended use, and funnel that money toward Harlow-controlled vendors, companies that, if you traced the ownership structure through enough shell layers, led back to Harlow Corp itself. It wasn't a new scheme. It was old. It was the kind of thing that happened in the shadows of infrastructure deals when nobody was paying close enough attention. But somebody was paying attention now. Patricia had already shared her preliminary findings with a contact at the FAA's Office of Inspector General. Quietly. Carefully. A formal referral was pending. Marcus had said almost nothing during the entire briefing. When Patricia finished, he'd sat very still for a long moment. Then he'd asked one question. "How much federal money are we talking about?" Patricia had looked at her folder. Over the full contract period. Best estimate. Between $60 and $80 million. Marcus had nodded slowly. "Okay," he'd said. "Keep going." Richard Harlow landed in New York 4 hours late, having been forced to charter a last-minute replacement aircraft from a competitor at triple the rate. He was in a foul mood when he arrived at the Midtown conference room where 3 of his board members were waiting. The meeting was supposed to be a formality, an update on the airport acquisition portfolio, a brief review of Q3 numbers, approval of 2 new vendor contracts. It did not go as planned. One of the board members, a woman named Helen Cho, who had joined the Harlow Corp board 14 months earlier after a long career at a regional bank, had received an unusual email that morning. She wasn't sure what to make of it yet. But she had printed it out. And she'd shown it quietly to 2 colleagues before the meeting started. The email was from an address she didn't recognize. It contained a 12-page document, a summary of the airport acquisition contract analysis, with specific clause references, grant amounts, and vendor ownership charts. There was no name attached. Just a subject line. You should know what you're approving. Helen Cho had spent her entire career in finance. She had a talent for reading between the lines of documents that other people skimmed. She'd spent the flight to New York reading the 12 pages 3 times. By the time Richard Harlow walked into the conference room, Helen Cho had already texted her attorney. When Harlow started his update, polished, confident, the performance of a man who had run these rooms for 20 years, Helen Cho waited. She waited until he got to the airport portfolio slide. And then she asked one question. "Richard," she said, her voice perfectly even, "can you walk me through the vendor ownership structure for the maintenance contracts in the Southeast Cluster?" Harlow barely blinked. "It's in the appendix, Helen. We can circle back. I'd like to discuss it now." The room got very quiet. 2 other board members exchanged a look. Harlow's smile stayed on his face. But something behind his eyes shifted, a tiny recalibration, the look of a man who has just heard a sound in a house he thought was empty. "Sure," he said. "Of course." But he hadn't brought the appendix. And Helen Cho, it turned out, had, over the next 2 weeks, things moved quietly. The kind of quietly that, in financial and regulatory circles, means everything is happening at once beneath the surface, calls being made, documents being gathered, attorneys being retained. The FAA's Office of Inspector General opened a preliminary inquiry. Harlow Corp's general counsel hired outside litigation support. 3 of the airport acquisition targets received document preservation notices. And Marcus Webb, back in Atlanta, watched all of it from a careful distance. He had not sent the email to Helen Cho. He wanted to be precise about that, at least to himself, on the nights when he sat with his coffee and thought about what he'd set in motion. He had shared Patricia Osei's analysis with one person, a journalist at a regional business publication he had quietly supported as an investor for 6 years. The journalist had done her own reporting. She had developed her own sources. Whatever happened next belonged to her investigation, not to Marcus. He hadn't orchestrated anything. He'd simply stopped looking away. That was a distinction that mattered to him. His mother had taught him a long time ago that there was a difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge was about you, your pain, your anger, your need to win. Accountability was about something larger. Something that didn't belong to you personally. Marcus wasn't angry at Richard Harlow for what he'd said on the tarmac. Not really. He was tired of the thing that Richard Harlow represented. The ease of it. The casual assumption that certain people could say anything, do anything, and nobody with the power to stop them would ever be paying close enough attention. Well, somebody had been paying attention. And then, 10 days after the New York board meeting, something happened that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Helen Cho's attorney filed a formal notification with the SEC. The article ran on a Thursday morning. It wasn't the New York Times. It wasn't the Wall Street Journal. It was the Atlanta Business Ledger, a regional publication with a modest readership, a strong reputation for accuracy, and a senior reporter named Jasmine Watkins who had been working the infrastructure beat for 9 years. The headline was careful. Measured. Deliberately not inflammatory. Harlow Corp airport acquisitions raise questions about federal grant compliance. But what was inside was not careful. It was thorough. It was documented. It had 4 named sources, including 2 former Harlow Corp employees, 1 municipal airport authority official, and 1 unnamed individual described only as a private aviation investor with direct knowledge of the acquisition structure. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 2 p.m., Harlow Corp stock had dropped 6%. By 4 p.m., Harlow's communications team issued a statement calling the article reckless and factually inaccurate. By 6 p.m., Harlow himself was on a call with his legal team, his PR firm, and 3 of his most loyal board members, trying to figure out where the leak had come from. They had 5 theories. None of them involved a man in gray coveralls standing next to a Gulfstream on a Tuesday morning. Marcus Webb's name did not appear anywhere in the article. It would not appear anywhere for another 3 weeks. It was a detail in the aircraft registration records that broke things open. A reporter at one of the national outlets, a younger journalist who covered aviation and infrastructure, had pulled the tail number from a photo taken by a ground crew member at Hartsfield-Jackson the morning of Harlow's delayed departure. The photo had been posted on an employee's private social media account, then deleted, but not before someone had screenshotted it. The tail number was N742WX. The reporter ran it through the FAA registry. The registered owner was a Delaware LLC called Cobalt Sky Holdings. Cobalt Sky Holdings was not a mysterious company. It was not hidden. Its operating agreement was a public document. Its sole member was listed plainly. Marcus A. Webb. The reporter found Marcus's LinkedIn in 4 minutes. Found his company's website in 6. Found a profile piece in a 2019 issue of Black Enterprise magazine in 8, a feature on minority-owned aviation businesses that included a photograph of Marcus standing in front of a Gulfstream G550, wearing, of all things, gray coveralls. The reporter called Marcus's office that afternoon. Diane Chen answered, took a message, and walked the note to Marcus's desk. Marcus read it. Sat with it for a moment. Then he called back. He did 1 interview. 30 minutes. He was direct, measured, and careful. He confirmed that he was the owner of the aircraft Harlow had chartered. He confirmed that he had been present on the tarmac that morning. He confirmed, in general terms, that he had concerns about Harlow Corp's airport acquisition practices and had shared those concerns with appropriate parties. When the reporter asked about what Harlow had said to him on the tarmac, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What he said to me wasn't the point. What matters is what I found out afterward. And I think that's the story." The reporter agreed. But she included the tarmac exchange anyway. She had 2 witnesses who had been there. She described what Harlow had said. She described Marcus's response, the single quiet smile, the unhurried return to the clipboard. The story ran 2 days later. It was a very different kind of headline. The man Harlow mocked on the tarmac owned the jet, and may have triggered the federal investigation that's now threatening his company. By Saturday morning, the story had been shared 1.4 million times. The Atlanta Commerce Club held its annual philanthropy summit on a Friday evening 6 weeks later. Ballroom. 800 guests. The kind of room where Atlanta's business, civic, and charitable worlds overlapped, where people got photographed and gave speeches and received Crystal Awards for their generosity. Richard Harlow was scheduled to receive the Pinnacle Award, a recognition of lifetime commitment to community development. It had been planned for months. Marcus had received his own invitation weeks earlier, as a board member of the Atlanta Aviation Education Foundation, one of the summit's co-sponsors. He almost didn't go. His daughter, Alicia, 26 years old, finishing her MBA at Emory, had told him he should. "Go, Dad," she'd said. "Just be yourself. You don't have to do anything. Just be in the room." He went. He wore a dark navy suit. No watch. No pocket square. Just the suit and the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. He arrived early and stood near the back of the room with a glass of water, talking to a few colleagues, watching the room fill. He saw Harlow arrive. Harlow looked different than he had on the tarmac. 6 weeks of federal inquiries, a 14% stock drop, 3 board resignations, and a PR crisis had taken something from him. The ease was still there, men like Harlow never fully lost it, but there was a tightness around his eyes now. A vigilance that hadn't been there before. Harlow's communications director had apparently advised him to attend. Show up. Act normal. Don't hide. That had been bad advice. Because Helen Cho was also in the room. And the FAA's regional administrator was there. And Jasmine Watkins from the Atlanta Business Ledger was there with a press credential and a notepad. And Marcus Webb was standing 40 feet away. The dinner went quietly for 90 minutes. Then the awards portion began. The MC, a television anchor Marcus recognized, began the introduction for the Pinnacle Award. He was 3 sentences in when one of the event organizers walked quickly to the podium and murmured something in his ear. The anchor paused. He looked down at his notes. He cleared his throat. "I've just been informed," he said carefully, "that tonight's Pinnacle Award presentation has been postponed. We'll be moving to our next honoree." The room murmured. Harlow was seated at a front table. He had gone very still. Marcus watched him from across the room and felt, not triumph, not satisfaction in the way he'd expected. What he felt was something quieter than that. Something closer to relief. Later, in the lobby, Harlow found Marcus. He approached alone. No bodyguards. No yes men. He stopped 2 feet away. They looked at each other for a long moment. "You did this," Harlow said. It wasn't an accusation. It was barely even a question. Just a man putting a shape to something he needed to understand. Marcus held his gaze. "I didn't do anything to you," Marcus said. "I just stopped looking the other way." Harlow opened his mouth. Closed it. "You could have come to me," Harlow said finally. "You could have." "What?" Marcus said quietly. "Mentioned it on the tarmac? Between the jokes." Harlow said nothing. "You didn't see me," Marcus said. "That's the whole problem. You've never seen me. You've never seen any of us. And you've been making decisions that hurt people, real people, in real communities, because nobody in your world ever made you look." He said it the way his mother had taught him to say hard things. Not loud. Not angry. Just true. He put down his water glass and walked out. The consequences came over the following months, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of the truth. The FAA's preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation. 3 airport authorities in Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee filed civil complaints. A federal grand jury was convened in Atlanta. Harlow Corp's Regional Airport Division was suspended from new federal contracts pending the outcome. The stock, which had peaked at $47 before the story broke, settled into the mid-20s and stayed there. Richard Harlow resigned as CEO in March. The announcement was a single paragraph, released on a Tuesday afternoon when the markets were closed. It cited a desire to focus on personal matters and allow the company to move forward. 2 of his top deputies, both of whom had been on the tarmac that Tuesday morning, left the company within 60 days of each other. Helen Cho was named interim board chair. Her first act was to commission an independent audit of every contract in the airport portfolio. Jasmine Watkins won a regional journalism award for her reporting. Patricia Osei's consulting firm picked up 4 new institutional clients who had read about her role in the story. Marcus Webb sold the Gulfstream G700 2 months later, to a charter company in Dubai, exactly as he'd originally planned. He reinvested the proceeds into the fractional ownership syndicate. The deal performed better than projected. He started a scholarship fund at the Hartsfield-Jackson Aviation Training Program, aimed at young people from South Atlanta who wanted to work in aviation. He named it quietly, without ceremony, after his mother. He did one more interview, a longer one, for a national magazine. The journalist asked him if he felt like he'd won. Marcus thought about the question for a while. "I don't think about it that way," he said. "I never wanted to win anything. I just wanted to be seen. Not me specifically, I mean people like me. People who've been building something real their whole lives and get looked through every single day because of what they look like or what they're wearing. He paused. Richard Harlow didn't destroy his career because I was standing on that tarmac. He destroyed it because of what he'd been doing for years. I just happened to be paying attention. The journalist asked one more question. If you could go back to that morning, would you do anything differently? Marcus smiled. The same quiet, unhurried smile he'd given on the tarmac. No, he said. I'd go back, check on my jet, and let him say whatever he wanted to say. Because I already knew something he didn't. What was that? That the loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful one. There's a photo that circulates sometimes, taken by a ground crew member that Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson, before the social media post was deleted. In it, Richard Harlow is walking toward the aircraft, surrounded by his entourage, his suit perfect, his stride commanding. And off to the side, slightly out of frame, almost as if the camera didn't think to include him, a black man in gray coveralls, clipboard in hand, looking down at his notes. He looks like nobody important. He looks like a man just doing his job. Which, of course, is exactly what he was. The jet behind them, gleaming white, $75 million of aluminum and engineering and possibility, belonged to the man in the coveralls. The future, it turned out, did too. Marcus Webb got home that Tuesday evening around 7. He made a simple dinner. He sat at his kitchen table and did what he did every night, reviewed his numbers, answered a few emails, thought about his mother. Before he went to bed, he walked out to the backyard and stood under the magnolia tree for a moment. Stay humble. Stay curious. And never, ever let anybody make you feel small. He went inside. He slept well.